One of the most important skills that I believe every photographer should have is to be able to take sharp pictures with any camera at any time. So in today's video, I want to teach you my 5-step process to take sharp pictures with any camera. Let's get started. Alright, so the first question that you want to ask yourself is whether you're shooting handheld or on a tripod. If you're shooting on a tripod, you can skip this step, but if you're shooting handheld, then you want to adjust your shutter speed at least twice your focal length. So what I mean by that is, as an example, if you're shooting with a 35mm length, then you want to shoot with at least a shutter speed of 1/70. For a 200mm lens, then you will want to use at least a shutter speed of 1/400 of a second. And this is basically to combat the small movement that you will make when you shoot handheld, to make sure that your pictures will not be affected by those small movements and will appear sharp. And a lot of people stop at this step, but this is only step number 1. However, this won't affect motion blur that can be introduced because of the movement of your subject. So let's move to step number 2 to deal with this. Alright, so the second question that you want to ask yourself is whether your subject is moving or not. If your subject is not moving, then just skip this step and go to step number 3. However, if your subject is moving, then here are some guidelines that I usually follow to make sure that I can freeze my subject movement and take sharp pictures. If you're taking pictures of people walking in the streets or portraits of people that are barely moving, then I would suggest to have a shutter speed that is at least 1/250 of a second. When it comes to portraits of people that are moving or pictures of animals, I would suggest a shutter speed of at least 1/1000 of a second. And finally, when it comes to shooting small animals like birds or sports, I would suggest a shutter speed that is at least 1/2000 of a second. And with those simple guidelines, let's now move to step number 3. Alright, so now that you have two values of shutter speeds from step number 1 and number 2, I want you to take the faster value from both of them. As an example, if you get in step number 1 1/400 and in step number 2 1/2000, then just pick 1/2000 because this is the one that would work in both cases. This is a pretty straightforward step, however it will ensure that you will have a shutter speed that will both compensate for your small movements and for the motion blur induced by the movement of your subject. Our next point is to use the correct focus mode. And what I mean by that is either continuous or single autofocus mode. Single autofocus mode is pretty straightforward. Once you have pressed your shutter button, your camera will acquire focus once based on where your focus point is in your composition. If you of your subject moved after your camera acquired focus, then you will have an autofocus picture. This focus mode is better suited for still subject, such as landscape or product photography. Continuous autofocus mode, on the other hand, will continuously adjust the focus of your camera based on your focus point in your composition. You don't need to half press your shutter button, and your camera will always be adjusting your focus. This focus mode is better suited for subjects that are moving, which is the case for genres like sports or wildlife photography. So now that you understand what both modes do, you can choose the correct focus mode based on what you're shooting. Alright, and finally we have to talk about aperture. So there are two ways in which aperture can affect the sharpness of your picture. First, with depth of field. The higher the aperture you use, the shallower the depth of field you will have. So as an example, when shooting landscape photography, as I want as much in focus as possible, I will usually put my aperture between f5.6 to f11. When shooting portrait photography in studio, as I have full control of the light that I'm using, I usually tend to fix my aperture to f5.6 or f8 to make sure that my whole subject is in focus. In some cases, for some stylistic choices, I would increase my aperture, but you have to realize that if you do that, there is a higher probability that your camera will miss focus. So next time that you want to make sure that you have a sharp picture, try to decrease your aperture a little bit and see how it works for you. A second way that your aperture value can affect the quality of your image is directly related to your lens. Every lens has basically a sweet aperture spot where it produces its sharpest results. So I invite you to make some tests with your lens at different aperture value, or to watch some review online to know which aperture range is the best for your lens. Alright, and that's pretty much it when it comes to take sharp pictures. It's all about nailing your shutter speed, your focus mode, and having the entirety of your subject in focus. So let me know if you have any question down in the comment. And if you're also looking for a way to nail your exposure every time, check out this video right here. See you there.